Hello, I'm your host, Peter Sawchuk, a professor of adult education and workplace learning at the University of Toronto. You're listening to Work, Learning, and Social Change Foundational Voices, an informal discussion with some of the figures who have helped to define the field. In this episode, I'm speaking to Linda Cooper, Associate Professor Emeritus at the School of Education of the University of Cape Town in South Africa, with work spanning 4 decades as both a trade union education researcher as well as an academic. She is known as one of the most defining international voices on organized labor, work, and learning. Welcome and hello. Our discussion series is meant to be informal, but let me begin with a few prepared remarks by way of introduction to our guest. In a lengthy, varied, and extraordinary set of careers within and outside academia, Linda Cooper has remained both dedicated to and fascinated by concerns of organized labor, work, learning, and critical consciousness, with special attention to the Global South and what has become understood now as a Southern perspective. She's a former chairperson of the International Labor Research and Information Group. She's a longtime member of the South African Development Institute for Training, Support, and Education of Labor. And indeed, before all that, throughout the 80s, and influenced in part by the work of Frere, she worked directly in the area of literacy and training and research in the South African trade union movement. She's authored or co-authored 4 books, including an exciting recent sole-authored monograph entitled Workers' Education in the Global South, Radical Adult Education at the Crossroads, Brill 2020. I first heard her speak at a symposium in the United Kingdom in the mid-1990s, not to make both her and I feel like we're getting on in age too much, but since then, she became and remains one of the very first scholars I think of when I think about labor education and the type of work and learning dynamics that matter most to workers and their movement. Linda, welcome to the discussion series. It's absolutely great to see you. And thanks for taking the time to contribute in this way. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine, and thank you for the kind way in which you presented my biography. And I'm really pleased to be here. And you know, I've retired a couple of years ago and really happy to be able to contribute to the growing of new researchers in the field.
Yeah, that's precisely what we're trying to do. So, and I can't think of a better person to help do that, especially in the area of adult learning, work, and labor education. Anyways, let me jump in right to my first question. We can get into discussion a little bit more. I personally feel there's a lot of recognizable things, but I've followed your work for many decades, but aspects of your research and your approach. But I want to ask you your own impressions and descriptions of your approach. Oftentimes people will read our work and have their own interpretation of it, but you know, the author writes what they write, and they do the work they do, but seldom gets the opportunity to actually frame it and discuss it. So I want to ask you, what's your own impressions of your approach to labor, work, learning, and social change research? What might be its strengths in your view, and what makes it distinct, and so on.
Thanks, Peter. You've outlined my, very ancient history when I was involved practically in workers' education within the labor movement. And I think that's probably one of the more distinctive parts of how I approach my work, which is that a lot of it is still shaped by my years of practice in the labor movement, and the kind of, I think the kind of value that I learnt that resides in ordinary people's knowledge. So I think that those sort of early lessons in the practice of labor education, I think, still shape my work. I actually did my undergraduate degree and my first postgraduate degree was in history. And I think that has also stayed with me through, much of my career in researching work and learning. I kind of feel comfortable writing in a historical mode, but I also think that a historical perspective does illuminate important social processes that you just don't capture without that historical approach. And the book that you mentioned, my monograph, my more recent book, is essentially a history, an analytical history of changes within workers' education in the case study of South Africa over time, but trying to draw out important insights that could have relevance, far more widely. Yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty obvious that my research work does come from the vantage point of workers. I think that a lot of work and learning research does come from the perspective of employers and is concerned with how to improve production or global competitiveness. So I think that interest in the learning of ordinary workers, and in particular, how they come to understand their own location within the world of work, and how they begin to defend their own interests, resist, and imagine, a different future for themselves. I think that one of the aspects that maybe marks out my work is an interest in knowledge. I think that we talk a lot about work and learning, but within our field we don't talk a lot about knowledge. And I was particularly influenced by the school of thought, and I'll come to that later, of experiential learning, and that field as attached to it, that I feel that field itself foregrounds learning almost at the exclusion of knowledge. So I think that my interest in workers' education has led to a concern with the knowledge that's often hidden from view. I have been involved in writing and researching around recognition of prior learning, and again, it's essentially about recognizing knowledge which is not often recognized and valued either in the academy or in the workplace. And I think an interest in theorizing knowledge. There's been a lot written about working knowledge, and a lot written certainly about academic disciplines and forms of knowledge within the academy. But I think there's very little that's been written about the nature of experiential knowledge, which itself is differentiated. I mean, there are many different kinds of experiential knowledge. So I've been concerned and interested to theorize that. Yeah.
It occurs to me, for some it'll be a subtle turn that you're mentioning here, that the difference between a learning and knowledge, closely related but away, but the distinction you're making, I think, is really, really important to blow up a little bit further, because it opens up, or does it open up for you, this question of the difference between knowledge of the world, I'll say it this way, knowledge of the world, work world, say, as it is, versus an independent knowledge. And what might independent knowledge kind of look like in this context? Because when you say workers' knowledge, it's obviously there's a qualifier there, and it's so fascinating to think of. And to tie back to one of your earlier points, there is this question of history, and like, is it even possible to understand knowledge without this sense of history? Because it has to have been, in essence, built culturally, has to kind of reside in an oral structure, a written structure, or anything in between, or a combination thereof. Have you thought anything around, well, I know you have, but could you speak a little bit about what truly marks workers' knowledge in all its variation, really, uh, but as independent, because there's a lot of research that studies work and takes for granted the nature of work and its purposes, for instance. But there's an independent knowledge form that is inherently political in all this. Does that make sense to you in terms of your approach?
Yes, it does. I'm imagining that what you're alluding to is the kind of knowledge which workers develop independently of what they are required to know in order to do their jobs properly. And I know, Peter, that you've researched and written on that as well. So there's a South African sociologist called Ari Cetas who has written on workers' culture and worker poetry and so on. And he studied the kind of thinking and you know, stories and poems even that workers made up during the course of their working day, simply to get through their day. So he captured that that sense that workers on the shop floor, even though it looks like they're behaving like machines, are actually living, thinking, creating beings. And yeah, I think, you know, besides the obvious issue of whether they develop class consciousness, whether they develop a sense of their own collectivity and their capacity to bring about change, they also have intellectual worlds that they inhabit even while they're doing pretty boring work.
And some examples from your work. I mean, RPL is a great example, the kind of recognition of prior learning. And I do remember some of the early papers you did on that and research you did on that. And, you know, raising the question of the bureaucratization possibly of labor movement. But to just step back a little bit, there's your approach has a combination, it seems to me, or tell me if you agree with this. This goes against the grain of the question, which is supposed to be your characterization of your own work, but I'm offering you a characterization that you can dispute or modify, which is there's a combination of sensitivity to the phenomena you talk about, the outer appearance and then the inner lives, learning and knowledge-based lives of workers. You have a combination of sensitivity to the existence of that, but sensitivity alone, part of your approach has tools, you know, methodological or theoretical, that allows you to, you know, like when you have a word for something, it means a lot for what you're able to see. I don't know, your approach, I had in my mind, and I made a little note to myself, it's critically and coherently, but still eclectic in a way. You bring together a number of different approaches or a number of different tools to go back to this main question here is how to see beneath the surface. Does that trigger any kind of way of talking about your work that might be helpful to the audience, or does it just send you off in the wrong way?
No, I think that I do adopt quite an eclectic approach, and it's sometimes got its own dangers, because I think, you know, one can sort of land up trying to do a bit of everything and ultimately not really doing anything, not shining the light on anything successfully enough. So I do have to be careful about that. But one of the questions that you mentioned to me that you wanted to explore, I don't know whether you'll let me do that now, is the kind of influences on me, the intellectual influences on me. And, you know, when I made some notes and tried to do some thinking about it, I looked at it and I thought, this is a lot, you know, it's coming from very different places. So I think that, you know, what I mean, my oldest intellectual influence probably is popular education, those popular education traditions. And, you know, I was trained to teach literacy using a Freirean method and so on. So I think that kind of early orientation towards social change was important. But I think what I tried to capture, and I think the tradition of learning in social movements helped me to think about, what I've tried to capture is that tension between the individual worker and the knowledge which resides in the individual worker, and the fact that both in the workplace and more broadly within the working class, knowledge is often held collectively. And I think that social movement learning theory does point towards that kind of collective body of knowledge which has its own momentum over and beyond individual workers.
And exists over time.
Yes.
We might not call it an institution, although in the case of the labor movement, it has an institutional face. And that it contains or helps stabilize history that can become knowledge and culture. I don't want to sidetrack you there, but I just, when the light bulbs go off, I have to scream.
No, and I think unlike academic knowledge, which is codified and, you know, you can find it in books, I think much of that is easy to get lost because it doesn't get codified. It gets carried in a movement, and when that movement dissipates, a lot of that knowledge gets lost. And I think you raised the fact of my acknowledging the bureaucratization and the downswing of workers' struggles in South Africa, and that has been the consequence of it. The other influence that I wanted to mention was feminist pedagogy or feminist theory, which I think has, you know, really alerted me, and, you know, that tension between interest in the intra-psychological world of workers and then the more socially shared world. But I think that feminist theory has helped me to think about forms of knowledge that are held by workers that aren't that easy to identify. I mean, there are other writers on work and learning who've also written about tacit knowledge and so on. But I think feminist theory has pointed towards things like emotional knowledge and embodied knowledge, which is held both individually and collectively, but it's kind of alerted me to looking for those aspects of knowledge within the workers' movement.
It's so fundamental. It's almost doesn't do it justice, but I know why you say it this way. The emotional, individual, and collective lives are so fundamental. I don't know if you would agree with this, but I've learned over the years that you just can't begin to approach the living, beating richness of the dynamics of learning without that, almost like the whole side of the picture of our emotional lives. As complex and difficult to access as it sometimes is, but I've seen that in your work quite a bit.
But just to return to the question of eclectic, I have read so much of your own work because you've worked within a chat paradigm, cultural historical activity theory. And it's a paradigm which is almost at odds with feminist theory, well, some forms of feminist theory and theories of social movement, because it is quite structuralist in its approach. Although I think for me it captures both the structure and agency in in conversation with one another.
This is the thing. Sorry, you should go on.
No, carry on.
Oh, this is the exact thing. You're one of the few people I look to when I talk about how I don't, I see the structures as very, there's this kind of structural appearance to this, and actual people writing, and it can write in very highly from a kind of structural perspective. It's almost a dominant theme in some ways. So I know exactly what you're talking about there. And I feel I'm on the outside of that theme by using it in a much more fluid and dynamic way, which, and I see, I'm challenged by my own eclecticism, but you do it, and we do it on this, a lot of the same topics, although geographically in different cultural and national contexts. And that's one of the things that I think's probably just tied me to your work, following it through the decades, because I thought to myself, she's successfully doing that thing that I'm trying to do. Yeah. With that structural aspect of it. Yeah. Especially. Yeah.
I think, for me, chat is probably far more a methodology than a theory. I mean, it is clearly a theoretical paradigm, but it has informed my way of thinking, methodologically. And I think it really does help to keep a whole range of things in view at one time. And it points to the importance of dwelling on contradictions and tensions that are really, the essence of life. And we need to, as researchers, I think finding those tensions and contradictions is very fruitful, because it does point to all sorts of new and interesting insights.
Yeah, that is a it can be understood as a primarily, even if you wanted to, a methodological contribution on not what you're going to find, but what direction to look, what kind of things to seek to uncover. So that does become methodological. It's a really, now I hear a kind of echoes a little bit of influence from kind of Marxist theory as well. That's pretty elements of your.
I mean, my earliest intellectual thinking was very strongly influenced by critical Marxism. I mean, I came to it. It was in the kind of late 1970s in South Africa, where students were reading Marx under the torchlight, because we weren't allowed to have Marx's text. But it was a Marxism which was a product of the 60s in Europe. So it was both that and some of the very traditional Marxist texts. So that really did shape my way of thinking about the world. And it stays with me till today. I have to be careful not to be, too mechanical in my thinking, because it does, I think, lead one in that direction. But and I've tried to take on board a lot of the what I call the post theories, the post-structuralist, the post-colonial theoretical theories. Like I mean, I found Raewyn Connell's work on theory from the South, from her, the Australian who actually visited South Africa a few years ago. I found her work incredibly interesting, and she manages to capture the way in which countries in the South, like India, South Africa, some of the Latin American countries, have actually generated their own theoretical perspectives, and yet we still, I still turn to those, very basic traditional ones.
Well, it's challenging. I know what you're talking about. You have to. It's tough to. What's the best way to put this? If I can, I've struggled with this too. You have to be able to talk in language that people out in the if you think of fields and even specific journal outlets as as sets of kind of conversations, you have to speak in some kind of recognizable way and then begin to. But what and it's always a challenge when trends, not always mere fashions, but sometimes move swiftly forward. And you have to kind of to be able to communicate even one's own position. You still have to communicate using some terms of reference of some kind. But I'm tying back to something you said earlier. It's the methodological contributions of things. It's got me really thinking about ways that you can avoid. You mentioned kind of structural approaches earlier, but then also the kind of a mechanistic Marxism. And probably the same thing can be applied to a lot of, any of the series of kind of contemporary schools of thought. But understanding them, honestly, this is an idea that hasn't been this clear until you mentioned this. But understanding from primarily a methodological perspective, maybe not not in terms of method, but methodological. Maybe we might say epistemological too. But those are the kind of allows that fluidity of thinking in new contexts when you have to understand things that you don't. Does that make sense at all? Because I feel like that's one of the things that us eclectics. That's almost something that allows us to still manage coherence, possibly.
Yeah. I mean, one of the questions you mentioned to me when we were thinking about this interview was whether I thought that the field of work and learning has become more accepted within the social sciences. And what was interesting was that I thought about it immediately in terms of it was yes. The answer was yes. I think it has, but my immediate thought was, but why? And methodologically, what I was thinking about was, what is it about the changing nature of work which has allowed a focus of learning to become more legitimate and significant and important? And that led me to think about the nature of work has undergone radical changes, as we know, in the last couple of decades. And we are living in a fourth industrial revolution, with whatever we want to call it. And, confronting things like artificial intelligence that are just, absolutely revolutionizing our world, and will do so for our children's generation. So it's not surprising that questions of knowledge and learning and so on are just becoming absolutely central to understanding what's happening with work. But that explanation itself says something about my perspective and the way in which I think and work.
Well, and I want to tie it to something that I know we both care about a lot and wonder about. And maybe there's a start of an answer to it there, which is we both feel that the labor education perspective on work and learning has its distinctiveness, and yet at the same time, I just practically speaking, this is anecdotal, I get fewer and fewer students who are doing research in a recognizable labor education, from a recognizable labor education perspective. So on the one hand, despite the kind of, and I agree with you that it's more understandable to talk about a workplace learning. I had a response from a journal editor sometimes we publish in Work and Learning and in adult education and literacy journals and all this kind of stuff in our careers, but sometimes we go out to political science or sociology journals. So a sociology journal editor responds to me by saying, well, this is all very good, but this seems to me more like a workplace learning study. Why don't you just frame it as that? It'll make perfect sense to our audience. Which was, 20 years ago, I would never have got a comment on that. But at the same time, here's where I'm trying to link the two. At the same time, there's a certain set of framings about what workplace learning is and can and should be. And I wonder if there's a relationship between what I'm seeing along the labor education perspective. It's more on the periphery than it used to be.
I think that's absolutely true, Peter. I completely agree with that. And you know, I think, again, just sort of taking a perspective from where I sit in South Africa, you know, when we were in the 1990s making that transition to a post-apartheid democratic South Africa, the labor movement was critically involved in trying to restructure our whole education and training system. And it was commissioning research, you know, from a worker's perspective to inform the kind of policies that they were strongly putting forward. None of that seems to have survived. There's, you know, the research that's being driven now is very much from the point of view of South Africa needing to be part of a competitive global economy, and that labor's perspective just feels like it has been lost, except, and I wanted to mention this, that I think in the context of South Africa and probably other southern locations, you know, the world of work has, some of it has followed the North in terms of becoming very highly digitalized and sophisticated technologically, but a huge world of work has been left out of that altogether. So, you know, there's a world of informal, the informal economy, and a world of unemployed. I mean, we've got close to 50% unemployment at the moment, probably closer to 60, 70% amongst youth. So there's been some very interesting work done by colleagues in the Eastern Cape, in what used to be a place called Port Elizabeth, it's now Gqeberha, where they have been researching amongst unemployed or informally employed workers what kind of education and training they feel, you know, they need, and what should you know, learn, what kind of learning do they need in order to earn a living and survive. So that is, you know, marked out as something quite special and very interesting. But I think, you know, organized labor seems to have lost the initiative. And I have a sense of people like myself, you know, there was a time when the labor movement is strong, where researchers are drawn towards it. You know, we actually either get asked, or otherwise we simply want to be involved in help, you know, in ensuring that our research can inform the interesting initiatives that they're taking. But where they're not doing that, yeah, researchers go elsewhere.
Well, it's an interesting observation, because now that you phrase it that way, maybe we might talk about the difference between labor studies writ large, yeah, versus organized labor studies, yes, or the forms of organization that maybe are emergent and we don't quite see it. Because now that you mention it that way, or if it's framed in the way you're mentioning, there are a lot of students studying the precariat and, yeah, gig economy, work and life. So it's labor studies, certainly labor studies, work and learning. Yeah. So it's interesting. And, you know, it's all so embedded in those things that you mentioned much earlier, which is just the exponential growth of the technologies, yeah, and the platformization. There's an interview I have earlier in our series here with a student who's doing work on platform economy and the difference it makes, also in the global south. Yeah. But and it's remarkable, the shape of labor studies, work and learning, how fast it's changing. Yeah.
I you know, when I was still on campus, I used to try and attend regular labor sociology seminars, and it always struck me that researchers in work and learning and labor sociologists really need to be speaking to each other more. And it's a pity that you know I mean they do in some cases, but often not. We a little bit you know, cut off from that mainstream. Yeah.
Well, it sounds like this might be some practical organizing work that people need to get done,
Yeah.
and people need to contribute to
Yes.
revitalizing the labor education
Yeah.
networks and streams
Yeah.
and all this kind of stuff.
Yes.
It does.
Yeah.
It hasn't seemed to just self-sustain.
Mm.
Well, for instance, in the work, researching work and learning, the RWL conference series, we can, because you've been involved in that series for so long, you
Yeah.
can, and you and I can remember back when it was a kind of taken for granted
Yes.
piece of the puzzle, very
Yeah.
large piece of the puzzle.
Yes.
And then
Yes.
over time, it's really shifted and
Mhm.
kind of dispersed in different
Mhm.
subtopics and areas. And yeah, which isn't to say there's not a lot of critical work being done. But yeah.
No, sure, but not that.
Yeah, not that.
Yeah.
I want to
Yeah.
ask you a question I find really exciting and important, and maybe it's just me, but I have a question, which is, and when there's time, I pose it to all the interviewees for this in these discussion series, and it's the idea of what is something that you can think of that, you know, whether it's a theory, whether it's a methodology, whether it's a, I don't know, some other perspective, whatever at all, things that you always had lingering, maybe not always, but have either recently or in the past had lingered in the back of mind of something you've always wanted to add to your work or consider or go down a road with a style of research, a topic, maybe, whatever, a theory, methodology, but something you had in your mind, but haven't pursued yet, something like that. You just haven't got to. I have a few of them, but I'm wondering if you have anything like that.
Well, in recent years, certainly, you know, the whole area of environment and the ecology, you know, I'm aware of it looming, you know, kind of hugely in our lives, and the importance of it. And you know, I've kept on thinking I really should get on top of that literature. And I mean, I hear about it on the news every day, but, you know, get on top of the academic literature and try and integrate an environmental perspective into my work, that it shouldn't be something that one does separately, but almost like, you know, feminism, that it's a perspective that you bring in. And I just haven't managed to do that. And it just feels it's running ahead so fast, I'll never catch up. But more, maybe sort of a lot further back in my career, yeah, it relates to my origins in history. And I always wanted to do more oral history. I just felt that yeah, that interest in the history of work and how it's shaped people and how people have shaped it, that it's and it would largely only be able to be captured orally, probably. So I at one stage I did read some wonderful books on oral history as a methodology, and oral history that had been done in places like Italy, and, you know, really interesting methodological innovations. But I just never managed to really make the time to get into that. And it does need a lot of time, and yeah.
You know, I share that interest. I did so much reading in just ahead of my doctoral thesis proposal on how I want to do an oral history. And I tried to do, you know, really take the methodological aspects serious, because it is a kind of a field, right? You know this. And I, you know, ended up not including that as part of the whole methodology, and hence I didn't take some of the details and nuance and the time. It's so important that you're talking about kind of extended oral engagements with people on this kind of thing. I've had a couple of students pick up on this and do it. And I tell you, they find the work the most satisfying social science research they
Yeah.
ever do.
Yes.
Yeah.
Mhm. And yeah, I vividly, it's interesting actually, because I also thought I would integrate it into my PhD work, and I also didn't manage it. But I remember reading a book by an Italian called Portelli, and he'd done this incredibly wonderful work with Italian peasants, rural people.
Mm.
And he wrote about memory, and how memory obviously gets distorted over time, and how we need to see the distortions as you know, important signals of things that have happened, or that are going on.
Mm-hmm.
He also said that as we go and research other people, those people are researching us at the same time, and they are
Awesome.
yeah, reading what they think of us, and what they think we're wanting from them, and what they might give us and maybe not give us. Anyway, it was a wonderful book.
Actually, now you're talking about key things that popped up. There was a fellow from Sweden, Ari Antikainen, who happened to be a visiting scholar when I entered my doctoral program at our place. And I had, there's a couple, we were encouraged to go to talks and everything. And that was one of the things, now I'm thinking about it, that got me thinking more about it. And you know, the kind of the social and historical phenomenon of the way we construct life stories, that they're not just, they're not divorced in the least from actual political, social dynamics, cultural dynamics. They're reflections of it in many ways, although through the personhood. Yeah.
Absolutely.
That's fascinating stuff, isn't it?
No, if we could inspire a new generation of researchers to do that, it would be wonderful.
Yeah, imagine if there was an oral history of labor, work, and learning.
Work and learning, yeah.
You know, kind of, oh, I don't know, a little scholarly community. Always try, the organizers in both of us, we're always trying to organize something, even if we don't get around to it, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
We've been going on for a little bit. I want to, well, if there's anything else you want to mention it now, because I have a closing question that I take really quite seriously, because part of our discussion series is about informing newer researchers, you know, sometimes young, sometimes not young, but newer researchers to the field, or certainly people exiting or completing, or in some process of doing their high degree, their doctoral degree. And I always want to end with people asking people about advice they would give to newer researchers. But I don't want to cut you off. If there's something else that maybe started bubbling there from either something we talked about earlier. Yeah. Okay, well, then I'll pose that question about advice you might have for newer researchers from your experience.
Yeah, I must say, when you sent me some questions to think about beforehand, this was the one I found the most difficult, just because there's so much one could say, and it's also really hard to find something really worth saying. The first thought that I had was that, and I speak, you know, from a very personal point of view here, is that I think if, you know, one can enter academia and the life of a researcher in a very pragmatic way, and, you know, do your job and do it well, and, you know, go home at the end of the day and forget about it. I have always felt very embedded in my research, very what's the word? Yeah, passionate about it. It's had a hold on me, what I've chosen to do, and I do think that the work of research is quite it's quite hard. It can feel very slow, very like you're not really achieving anything, that you're not saying anything new. So the first piece of advice was to say it would help if you are researching something that you feel, you know, implicated in, that you feel passionate about, and that will sustain you over quite a long period of time, so that you can build incrementally, and that it's not just a bit of this year and a bit of that the next year. So that was the first thought I had. Then the second thought, I suppose, was, the feeling, I'm sitting at the end of a research career and kind of wondering, has anybody actually read what I've written, and does it matter anyway? And I think it's very hard, it's very easy to feel discouraged in the world of any research, let alone work and learning, and feel that, it's hard to have to gain a sense of making a difference. And I think, I think it's worth remembering that knowledge does get built very slowly over time, over long periods of time, and it gets built between people in critical conversation with one another. So yeah, that was the second thought I just had, was just don't feel discouraged if you can't sort of name 30 people that have read your work, or have a feeling of making a real impact on policymakers or whatever. And then I think the third point was really about, again, coming very much out of my own identity as a social change activist, that, I found it very hard to, in the beginning, to not want to, talk and put forward my own points of view. And I, in fact, even before I really started on the career of academic research, I had to learn to really listen to people. And I think it was something that I learned in my work as a worker educator. But I think it's important for us to really believe that people do have something important to say. So we're not just asking them because it's part of our research plan. That I think people in many different walks of life, but workers in particular, have things really that we can learn from. So yeah, to try and just put aside one's own activism and listen and learn as a researcher is a real skill, and it's something worth learning to do. Yeah,
it's an exciting moment when you do that. I for a second I thought you were giving me advice, because everything rung true for me. Okay, but
yeah.
that also, that last point on the excitingness of, I don't know how to describe that mindset, but opening up to really hearing, well, both you and I do a lot of qualitative work, and that in the case of, say, interviews, really hearing and discovering. It sounds not easy. It doesn't. Well, I don't know if it sounds easy, but you have to have a mindset to discover and be open to discovering and hearing.
And being willing to hear stuff that you don't particularly want to hear. And I remember reading some of your work, Peter, among social workers, and I could almost feel you as a researcher hearing stuff which maybe not that you didn't want to hear, but it wasn't what you were expecting. It wasn't part of the expected pattern, and it was what became the heart of the knowledge production in that effort.
Yeah, in our researches, hearing stuff that we don't really expect, or you were right in the first instance as well, which is there are things I didn't want to hear from people, but that's the complexity of messiness of the stuff we're
learning as well.
Yeah, I know it's tough stuff. That was really, really helpful advice. I'm gonna, well, I edit all this stuff together, but I'm gonna dwell on this last segment, and it really, really is helpful to me. And
thank you. And I mean, it's very generic. It's not specific.
I don't know. It felt very personal to me. I don't know. But we both admitted that we're reading each other. So at least there's us.
Yes.
I hear you. Okay. Well, I'm going to say goodbye, but I want to thank you again
for speaking to you.
making the contribution. It's so important that people, they read work, but they, they need to see a face. I think sometimes it almost bears on your point about the kind of whole human and emotional side of connection. And so I really, really thank you for spending time with me. I know it's time zone challenges and everything. I really appreciate you arranging your day such that.
I think I think this is a wonderful project. I wish that I'd thought of it, and I really am very grateful to have contributed something. Really, thank you.
It's one of the few good things that came out of COVID.
Right.
Anyways, okay. Well, I'll say goodbye. Have a great day, and we'll talk soon.
Bye-bye then. Thanks.
Bye-bye.